Sarah Martinez stood at the coffee shop counter, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her wallet. The familiar weight of stares pressed against her back like a physical force. She had grown accustomed to the whispers and pointed looks, but today felt different. Today the judgment seemed heavier, more cruel. The tattoo on her left forearm was clearly visible beneath her rolled-up sleeve. To most people passing by, it looked like an intricate design of intertwined roses and thorns with strange symbols woven throughout. But Sarah knew what it really meant. Every line, every curve, every carefully placed element told a story that had cost her everything she once held dear. "That's quite some artwork you've got there," the barista said with a forced smile. Her eyes darting nervously to Sarah's arm. "Must have been expensive." Sarah nodded quietly, not trusting her voice. She had learned that explaining only made things worse. People didn't want to hear the truth behind the ink that covered her skin. They preferred their assumptions, their quick judgments, their comfortable distance from reality. Behind her, she could hear the hushed conversation of two women who had been watching her since she entered the cafe. Their words cut through the ambient noise like shards of glass. "Look at her arm. Probably some gang thing or prison tattoo. You can always tell by the way they carry themselves." "I know, right? And in broad daylight, just showing it off like that. No shame whatsoever. People like that shouldn't be allowed in places like this." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes fixed on the menu board above the counter. She had heard variations of these comments countless times over the past 2 years. The assumptions about her character, her background, her worth as a human being, all based on the permanent reminder she carried on her skin. The truth was far more complex than anyone bothered to consider. The tattoo wasn't a symbol of rebellion or criminal activity. It was a memorial, a promise, and a burden all woven together in black ink and painful memories. Each element represented someone she had lost, someone she had failed to save, someone whose memory she carried with her every single day. "Your total is $4.50, the barista announced, breaking Sarah's reverie. As she handed over the money, Sarah noticed the young woman behind the counter staring at her tattoo with a mixture of fear and disgust. It was a look she knew well, one that had become as familiar as her own reflection. She had stopped trying to explain or defend herself months ago. Experience had taught her that the truth often made people more uncomfortable than their misconceptions. The two women behind her had grown bolder in their commentary, their voices rising just enough to ensure Sarah could hear every word. "My husband says people like her are what's wrong with this country. No respect for themselves or anyone else. Probably on welfare too, spending our tax dollars on fancy coffee while decent people struggle to make ends meet. Absolutely disgusting. And the way she just stands there so brazenly, not even trying to cover it up. In my day, people like that knew their place." Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. She had endured months of this treatment, had accepted it as the price she would pay for the choices she had made. But today, something inside her felt raw and exposed, like a wound that refused to heal. The coffee shop was busier than usual, filled with the afternoon crowd of professionals, students, and retirees. Most were absorbed in their own conversations or devices, but Sarah could feel the weight of those who had noticed her, who were making their own silent judgments about the woman with the mysterious tattoo. She had chosen this particular coffee shop because it was far from her neighborhood, far from anyone who might recognize her. Here she could be anonymous, just another customer in line. But anonymity came with its own price. Without context, without her story, she became whatever people's prejudices painted her to be. "Here's your coffee," the barista said, sliding the cup across the counter with obvious reluctance to make physical contact. Sarah thanked her quietly and turned to find a seat, scanning the crowded room for an isolated corner where she could drink her coffee in peace. The two women who had been commenting about her moved aside dramatically as she passed, making their disgust abundantly clear. She found a small table near the window, away from the main flow of traffic. As she settled into her chair, Sarah caught her reflection in the glass. She looked tired, older than her 32 years. The stress of the past 2 years had taken its toll, etching lines around her eyes and stealing the color from her cheeks. The tattoo artist had warned her about this when she first sat in his chair. "You sure about this design?" he had asked, studying the intricate pattern she had brought him. "It's beautiful work, but it's going to draw attention. People are going to ask questions." Sarah had been sure then, driven by grief and guilt that demanded a permanent mark. a visible reminder of her commitment to never forget. She had thought she was prepared for the consequences, for the questions and stares. She had underestimated how cruel strangers could be when they felt safe in their assumptions. Now, sitting alone with her coffee, Sarah wondered if she had made the right choice. The memorial on her arm had become a barrier between her and the world, a constant source of judgment and isolation. She had wanted to honor those she had lost, but instead she had created a prison for herself, one made of ink and other people's ignorance. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, highlighting the detailed artwork on her forearm. Despite everything, it was beautiful. The artist had captured exactly what she had envisioned, every element perfectly placed, every line purposeful. But beauty, she had learned, was often in the eye of the beholder, and most beholders saw only what they expected to see. As Sarah sipped her coffee, she tried to push away the familiar weight of loneliness that accompanied these public outings. She had learned to find strength in solitude, to build walls high enough to protect herself from the worst of the judgment. But some days, like today, the walls felt thin and insufficient, and the world outside seemed particularly harsh and unforgiving. The morning started like any other for Sarah. She had developed a routine over the past months, a carefully structured day that minimized her exposure to the outside world and the judgment that came with it. But today was different because today she had no choice but to venture into one of the places she dreaded most, the grocery store. Her apartment was nearly empty of food, and she couldn't put off the trip any longer. She had tried grocery delivery services, but the fees were eating into her already tight budget. The part-time job she had managed to secure at a local bookstore paid barely enough to cover her basic expenses, and luxuries like delivery fees were beyond her reach. Sarah pulled on a long-sleeved shirt despite the warm weather, hoping to cover as much of her tattoo as possible. She had learned that partial concealment sometimes worked better than full exposure, giving people less to focus on and comment about. But the intricate design extended too far down her arm to hide completely, and the detailed work near her wrist remained visible no matter what she wore. The grocery store was crowded with the usual Saturday morning rush. Families with children filled the aisles. Couples argued over shopping lists, and elderly shoppers moved slowly through the produce section. Sarah grabbed a cart and tried to navigate through the chaos as quickly and quietly as possible. She had made it through most of her shopping without incident when she turned into the cereal aisle and nearly collided with a mother pushing a cart with twin toddlers. The woman looked up with an apology on her lips, but the words died when her eyes landed on Sarah's exposed tattoo. "Oh my God," the woman gasped, instinctively pulling her cart backward and positioning herself between Sarah and her children. "Stay away from us." The toddlers, sensing their mother's distress, began to whimper and reach for her. Other shoppers in the aisle turned to see what was happening, their curious gazes quickly shifting to judgment when they spotted the source of the commotion. "Please," Sarah said quietly, raising her hands in a peaceful gesture. "I'm just trying to shop. I don't want any trouble." But the damage was done. The mother's reaction had drawn attention, and now several other shoppers were staring openly at Sarah's tattoo, their faces displaying the familiar mixture of fear and disgust she had come to expect. "That's a gang tattoo if I ever saw one," an elderly man announced loudly, positioning himself protectively near the mother and children. "Probably marking territory or something. These people have no business being around decent families." Sarah felt her face burn with shame and frustration. She wanted to explain, to tell them what the tattoo really meant, but experience had taught her that the truth often fell on deaf ears. People preferred their assumptions because they were simpler, cleaner, and required no empathy or understanding. "I think we should call security," another shopper chimed in, a middle-aged woman clutching her purse tightly. This is exactly the kind of person who shouldn't be allowed in family stores. The whispers grew louder, and Sarah found herself surrounded by a semicircle of concerned shoppers, all united in their certainty that she represented some kind of threat. Children were pulled closer to their parents, and several people had their phones out, some recording the encounter. Sarah abandoned her cart and tried to walk away, but the crowd followed her, their voices growing more confident and cruel with each step. She felt trapped, cornered by people who had decided her worth based on a single glimpse of her tattoo. "Look at her running away," someone called out, probably guilty of something. "These gang members are all the same, all cowards when confronted." The security guard appeared just as Sarah reached the front of the store, his hand resting on his radio as he approached. She could see in his eyes that he had already made up his mind about the situation, based on the reports he was receiving through his earpiece. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the store," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who dealt with troublemakers regularly. "We've had complaints about your behavior and it's disrupting other customers." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "My behavior? I haven't done anything except try to buy groceries. I haven't spoken to anyone or caused any problems. The tattoo, ma'am. It's making people uncomfortable, and we have a responsibility to our customers to maintain a safe shopping environment." The crowd behind her murmured their approval, satisfied that justice was being served. Sarah felt the familiar burn of tears behind her eyes, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She had learned that showing emotion only made people more certain of their judgments. "Fine," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "I'll leave." As she walked toward the exit, the whispers followed her like a toxic cloud. She could hear fragments of conversations, people sharing their theories about what kind of person she must be, what crimes she had probably committed, what danger she represented to their safe, suburban world. Outside in the parking lot, Sarah sat in her car for several minutes, trying to compose herself before driving home. The sun was warm on her face through the windshield, but she felt cold inside, hollowed out by the encounter. This wasn't the first time she had been asked to leave a public place, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. She thought about the woman with the twin toddlers, how quickly fear had replaced polite indifference when she saw the tattoo. Sarah wondered if that mother would go home and tell her husband about the dangerous person she had encountered at the store, how she had protected their children from whatever threat Sarah was supposed to represent. The irony was bitter and overwhelming. The very thing that marked her as dangerous in these people's eyes was actually a symbol of her dedication to protecting others, a permanent reminder of her commitment to service and sacrifice. But context was everything, and without it, she was just another person to be feared and avoided. Sarah started her car and drove to a different grocery store across town, one where she was less likely to be recognized or remembered. She would have to be more careful, more strategic about when and where she showed her face. The world had made it clear that people like her weren't welcome in certain spaces, and she would have to learn to navigate around those boundaries if she wanted to survive. 3 weeks had passed since the grocery store incident, and Sarah had become even more careful about her public appearances. She had found a small market on the outskirts of town where the owner, an elderly immigrant man, seemed indifferent to her tattoo. He never asked questions or made comments, simply rang up her purchases with quiet efficiency. Today, however, she had no choice but to venture into the city center. Her landlord had demanded she appear in person to sign new lease papers, refusing to handle the matter over the phone or through email. Sarah suspected he wanted to see her face to face to assess whether she was the kind of tenant he wanted to keep, especially after some of the neighbors had been asking questions about her. The government building where she needed to notarize the documents was located in the heart of downtown, surrounded by busy streets and filled with people from all walks of life. Sarah had hoped the diversity and chaos of the city center might provide some anonymity, but she quickly realized that crowds only amplified the stares and whispers. She had barely entered the building when she heard the first comment. "Look, at that one," a woman in an expensive suit whispered to her companion. "Probably here for court or something criminal. You can always tell by the tattoos." Sarah kept her head down and focused on finding the right office, but the building's layout was confusing, and she found herself walking in circles. Every time she stopped to check the directory, she could feel eyes on her, assessing and judging based on the visible portions of her tattoo. Finally, she found the notary office and took a number, settling into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs to wait her turn. The waiting area was full of people handling various legal matters, and the atmosphere was already tense with bureaucratic frustration. An older woman sitting across from her kept glancing at her tattoo and shaking her head disapprovingly. After several minutes of this silent judgment, the woman leaned over to the man next to her. "In my day, decent people didn't mark themselves up like that," she said, her voice just loud enough for Sarah to hear. "It's like they're advertising what kind of person they are. Makes it easier for the rest of us to know who to avoid." The man nodded in agreement, his eyes also fixed on Sarah's arm. "My son's in law enforcement, and he says they use tattoos like that to identify gang members and criminals. It's like a resume for troublemakers." Sarah shifted in her chair, trying to angle her arm away from their direct line of sight, but the movement only drew more attention. A young mother with a baby moved to a different section of the waiting area, clearly uncomfortable with Sarah's presence. "Number 47, the clerk called out. Sarah checked her ticket. She was number 52, which meant she had several more minutes of enduring the scrutiny and commentary. She considered leaving and coming back another day, but she knew the landlord wouldn't accept any delays, and she couldn't afford to lose her apartment. The whispers continued around her, growing bolder as more people noticed her tattoo and began sharing their theories about its meaning. Sarah felt like an exhibit in a museum, something to be observed and discussed but never directly engaged with as a human being. "I bet she's here for a restraining order violation," someone speculated. "People with tattoos like that are always getting in trouble with the law. Or maybe she's trying to get benefits she doesn't deserve," another voice added. "You know how these people game the system." The assumptions were becoming more cruel and specific, each person building on the last person's theory to create an elaborate fiction about Sarah's life and character. She wanted to stand up and scream the truth, to tell them about the real meaning behind her tattoo, but she knew it would only make things worse. A security guard had noticed the commotion and was watching Sarah carefully, his hand resting on his radio. She could see him trying to decide whether she represented a threat that needed to be addressed, whether the other people's discomfort was justified enough to warrant action. "Number 49, the clerk announced. Sarah was getting closer, but the wait felt endless. The baby across the room had started crying, and the mother shot accusatory looks in Sarah's direction, as if her mere presence was upsetting the child. The older couple continued their commentary, now joined by several other people who had been drawn into their conversation. "It's a shame they let people like that into government buildings," the woman was saying. "There should be dress codes or something, standards." "Absolutely," her companion agreed. "If you're going to conduct official business, you should at least have the decency to cover up those kinds of markings. Show some respect for public spaces." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to practice the breathing exercises she had learned from a meditation app. She pictured herself somewhere else, somewhere peaceful where she wasn't constantly defending her right to exist in public spaces, but the voices around her made it impossible to find that mental refuge. "Number 50, the clerk called. Almost there. Sarah gathered her paperwork and prepared to move forward in line. She could feel the tension in the room, the way conversation stopped when she stood up and moved. The security guard's attention sharpened, and she knew he was ready to intervene if anyone complained about her behavior. The young mother with the baby stood up abruptly and approached the clerk's window, cutting in front of the people whose numbers hadn't been called yet. "Excuse me," she said loudly, "but I'm not comfortable waiting in here with that person." She gestured toward Sarah without looking at her directly. "Can I be moved to a different area or have my documents processed somewhere else?" The clerk looked confused and flustered. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but everyone has to wait their turn, and this is the only notary office in the building." "Then what am I supposed to do?" the woman demanded. "I have a baby to think about. I shouldn't have to expose my child to people like that." The security guard finally approached, his expression stern and official. Sarah knew what was coming before he even opened his mouth. She had been through this routine enough times to recognize the signs. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Sarah directly, "I'm going to have to ask you to step outside for a few minutes. We've received some complaints, and I need to assess the situation." Sarah looked at her ticket, then at the line of people still ahead of her. "But my number is about to be called. I've been waiting for almost an hour. I understand, but we need to prioritize the comfort and safety of all our visitors. Once things calm down, you can come back and resume your place in line." It was the same lie she had heard before, the polite fiction that she would be allowed back once the situation was resolved. In reality, she knew she would be asked to return another day, forced to start the entire process over again. Sarah found herself standing outside the government building, her paperwork clutched in her trembling hands. The security guard had been polite but firm, suggesting she return the following week when it might be less crowded. She knew it was code for hoping she would simply give up and go away, permanently. The afternoon sun beat down on the concrete steps where she sat, trying to figure out her next move. Her landlord had already extended the deadline once, and she couldn't afford to delay the lease signing any longer. The threat of eviction loomed over her like a dark cloud, adding another layer of stress to her already overwhelming situation. As she sat there contemplating her options, a small group of teenagers approached the building. They were laughing and talking loudly, their voices carrying across the plaza. Sarah instinctively tensed, knowing that young people could be particularly cruel in their observations and comments. Sure enough, one of them spotted her tattoo and nudged his friends. "Check it out," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Look at that freaky tattoo on that woman." The group slowed their pace, openly staring at Sarah's arm. She tried to cover it with her other hand, but the intricate design was too large to hide completely. The teenagers circled closer, their curiosity overriding any sense of politeness or personal space. "Dude, that's like some serious ink," another one commented. "Must have cost a fortune. Wonder what she did to earn something like that." "Probably prison art," a girl in the group suggested with a laugh. "My cousin says they have tattoo guns in jail, and people get marked up to show what gang they're in or what crimes they committed." Sarah stood up, hoping to escape their attention, but the movement only made her more interesting to them. They followed her as she tried to walk away, their comments becoming louder and more creative. "Hey lady," one of them called out. "What's that tattoo supposed to mean? Is it like a warning for other people or something?" Sarah quickened her pace, but the teenagers were persistent. They had turned her into entertainment, a break from their mundane afternoon. Their phones came out and she realized they were recording her, probably planning to post videos online with mocking commentary. "Come on, just tell us," another one pressed. "We're not judging. We just want to know what it represents. Is it like a gang thing or a prison thing or what?" The desperation in Sarah's movements seemed to encourage them further. They sensed her vulnerability and pressed their advantage, following her across the plaza while documenting her obvious distress. Other people in the area had begun to notice the commotion, and Sarah found herself the center of unwanted attention once again. "Leave me alone," she finally said, turning to face the group. "I haven't done anything to you. Please just let me go in peace." But her plea only made them more excited. They had gotten a reaction, proof that their harassment was having an effect. The leader of the group, a tall boy with bleached hair, stepped closer. "We're not doing anything wrong," he said with false innocence. "It's a public place and we're just curious about your artwork. If you're going to display it in public, people are going to ask questions." Sarah felt trapped between the teenagers and a growing crowd of onlookers who had stopped to watch the confrontation. She could see some of them filming as well, and she realized this incident would probably end up on social media with her face and tattoo exposed to even more judgment and ridicule. "Just tell us what it means," the girl in the group insisted. "If it's something cool, we might want to get something similar. If it's something bad, well, at least we'll know to stay away from people who have them." The casual cruelty of the comment hit Sarah like a physical blow. These young people saw her as nothing more than a curiosity, a specimen to be examined and discussed for their entertainment. They had no concept of the pain behind her tattoo, the loss and sacrifice it represented, the way it had isolated her from the world they moved through so carelessly. An older man who had been watching the scene unfold finally stepped forward. "You kids need to leave this woman alone," he said with authority. "Whatever problem she has, they're not your business." But instead of helping, his intervention only made things worse. The teenagers turned their attention to him, arguing that they had the right to be curious about someone who displayed gang symbols in public. The man's defense of Sarah was interpreted as evidence that she was indeed dangerous, someone who needed protecting from innocent young people. "See?" the bleached-haired boy said triumphantly. "Even he knows there's something wrong with her. Why else would he be worried about us talking to her?" More phones came out and Sarah realized the incident was escalating beyond her control. Soon there would be videos online of her being confronted by concerned citizens, her face and tattoo broadcast to thousands of strangers who would make their own judgments about her character and worth. She tried once more to walk away, but the crowd had grown larger and more interested. Someone had called building security and she could see uniformed guards approaching. She knew how this would end, with her being escorted away while the teenagers were told to move along, their harassment treated as innocent curiosity, while her presence was deemed disruptive. "Ma'am," one of the security guards called out as he approached, "we're going to need you to move away from the building. You're causing a disturbance." Sarah looked around at the crowd of people filming and commenting, At the teenagers who had started the whole confrontation, at the man who had tried to help but had only made things worse. She was the only one being asked to leave, the only one whose behavior was being deemed problematic. "I'm not the one causing problems," she said quietly. "I was just trying to handle some paperwork, and these kids started harassing me." But the security guard had already made up his mind based on the reports he had received and the scene before him. A woman with obvious gang tattoos being confronted by concerned citizens was a familiar narrative, one that fit neatly into his understanding of how these situations typically unfolded. "I understand there may have been a misunderstanding," he said diplomatically, "but right now I need you to clear the area so we can restore order. You can come back another time when things are calmer." Sarah looked at her paperwork, at the deadline she was now certain to miss, at the eviction notice that would probably follow. She thought about the teenagers who would go home with a story about confronting a dangerous gang member, about the videos that would circulate online, about the way her face and tattoo would become symbols of everything people feared about strangers who looked different. 2 months had passed since the incident at the government building, and Sarah had managed to find a different notary office in a quieter part of town to handle her lease paperwork. The eviction threat had been resolved, but the stress of constant public scrutiny was taking its toll on her mental and physical health. She had lost weight from the anxiety and had developed a habit of staying indoors whenever possible. Her world had shrunk to the few places where she felt relatively safe: her apartment, the small bookstore where she worked, and the immigrant-owned market where the owner minded his own business. Today was different because she had received a letter that forced her out of her carefully constructed bubble. The letter was from the Department of Veterans Affairs, requesting her presence at a ceremony honoring military families who had lost loved ones in service. Sarah's hands had shaken as she read the invitation, knowing it meant she would have to enter another public space where her tattoo would draw attention and judgment. The ceremony was being held at the city's main memorial park, a place Sarah had avoided since moving to town. Parks attracted families, children, and exactly the kind of people who had made her life so difficult over the past months. But this wasn't optional. The letter specifically mentioned her brother's name and his unit, making it clear that his sacrifice was being remembered and honored. Sarah arrived at the park early, hoping to find a quiet spot where she could observe the ceremony without becoming the center of attention. The morning was crisp and clear, and she could see workers setting up chairs and a small stage near the main memorial wall. As more people began to arrive, Sarah felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. Families dressed in their best clothes walked past her bench, many of them carrying photos of their lost loved ones. She watched from a distance as they greeted each other, sharing stories and offering comfort. Sarah had brought her own photo, a small framed picture of her brother Marcus in his dress uniform. He was smiling in the photo, his eyes bright with the optimism that had carried him through basic training and deployment. The tattoo on her arm was a tribute to him and 3 other members of his unit who had died in the same attack that had claimed his life. "Excuse me," a woman's voice interrupted her thoughts. Sarah looked up to see a middle-aged lady in a black dress standing nearby. "Are you here for the memorial service?" Sarah nodded, uncertain where this conversation was heading. The woman's eyes had already found her tattoo, and Sarah could see the familiar look of judgment beginning to form on her face. "I don't think this is appropriate," the woman said, her voice growing stern. "This is a solemn occasion honoring our fallen heroes. It's not a place for people like you to make some kind of statement." "People like me?" Sarah asked quietly, genuinely confused by the woman's hostility. "With those gang markings," the woman clarified, gesturing toward Sarah's arm. "This ceremony is for families who have sacrificed for our country, not for criminals looking to cause trouble or make themselves the center of attention." Sarah felt the words hit her like physical blows. This woman had no idea who she was or why she was there, but she had already decided that Sarah's presence was somehow disrespectful to the memory of fallen soldiers. The irony was almost too painful to bear. "I'm here because my brother died in Afghanistan," Sarah said softly, holding up the framed photo. "This tattoo is a memorial to him and his unit members who were killed in the same attack." The woman's expression didn't change. If anything, she seemed more suspicious. "Anyone can claim to have a military connection," she said dismissively. "Real military families don't mark themselves up like gang members." We honor our fallen with dignity, not with street art. Other people had begun to notice the conversation, and Sarah could feel the familiar weight of stares and whispers beginning to press down on her. She recognized several faces from previous encounters around town, people who had already formed opinions about her character based on her appearance. "She's trying to crash the ceremony," someone whispered, "probably looking for sympathy or handouts." "The nerve of some people," another voice added, "using our hero's sacrifice to justify their criminal lifestyle." Sarah looked around desperately for someone in charge, someone who might have a list of invited families or some way to verify her right to be there. But the ceremony was informal, organized by community volunteers who had relied on word of mouth and newspaper announcements to spread the word. A small group had formed around the woman who had first confronted Sarah, and their voices were growing louder and more confident. They had convinced themselves that they were protecting the sanctity of the memorial service by challenging an obvious intruder. "You need to leave," the woman in black declared. "This is a private ceremony for real military families, not for people pretending to have connections they don't have." Sarah pulled out the official invitation letter, hoping it would prove her legitimacy. But the crowd around her was no longer interested in evidence or explanations. They had identified a threat to their sacred space and were united in their determination to remove it. "Anyone can fake a letter," someone scoffed. "Look at her. Does she look like military family material to you?" The photo of Marcus slipped from Sarah's trembling hands and fell to the ground. As she bent to pick it up, she could hear more people joining the group, their voices blending into a chorus of indignation and righteousness. "My son died for this country," an elderly man announced, "and I won't stand by and watch some gang member desecrate his memory." "Call the police," a younger woman suggested. "She's obviously trespassing and trying to disrupt a sacred ceremony." Sarah clutched Marcus's photo to her chest and looked around at the faces surrounding her. These were military families, people who had lost loved ones in service to their country, people who should have understood the depth of sacrifice and loss that her tattoo represented. Instead, they saw only what they expected to see: a dangerous outsider who didn't belong in their world of grief and honor. The irony was crushing. Marcus had died serving alongside soldiers from every conceivable background, fighting for the freedom and diversity that these people claimed to value. He had written letters home about the bonds formed in combat, how soldiers became family regardless of where they came from or what they looked like. But here, at a ceremony meant to honor his sacrifice, his own sister was being treated like a criminal because she chose to memorialize him in a way that didn't conform to their expectations of proper grief. The tattoo that connected her to Marcus and his fallen brothers in arms had become a barrier between her and the very community that should have welcomed her. Security personnel were approaching now, called by concerned families who wanted the disruption removed. Sarah knew she had only moments before she would be escorted away from the ceremony honoring her brother's sacrifice, banned from the very event she had been officially invited to attend. The security guards were only steps away when a commanding voice cut through the growing commotion like a knife through silk. "What exactly is happening here?" Sarah looked up to see a tall man in military dress uniform approaching the group. His bearing was unmistakably military, with the kind of presence that commanded immediate attention and respect. The crowd that had been so vocal in their condemnation of Sarah suddenly fell silent, uncertain how to explain their actions to someone who clearly outranked their civilian authority. The woman in black who had started the confrontation stepped forward, her voice less confident than it had been moments before. "We were just trying to protect the dignity of this ceremony, sir. This woman doesn't belong here. She has gang tattoos and is clearly trying to disrupt our memorial service." The officer's eyes moved to Sarah, taking in her appearance and the visible portions of her tattoo. For a moment, Sarah feared he would join the crowd in their judgment, adding military authority to their civilian prejudices. But something in his expression shifted as his gaze lingered on the intricate design on her arm. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Sarah directly, "would you mind showing me your tattoo more clearly?" Sarah hesitated, knowing that displaying it fully would likely make things worse. But there was something in the officer's tone that suggested genuine interest rather than condemnation. With trembling hands, she rolled up her sleeve to reveal the complete design. The officer studied the tattoo carefully, his trained eye taking in details that the civilian crowd had missed or misinterpreted. What they saw as gang symbols he recognized as something entirely different. The intertwined roses weren't random decoration but carefully placed memorials. The symbols they found threatening were actually military unit insignia and coordinates. "This is a memorial tattoo," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of understanding that silenced the murmuring crowd. "These aren't gang markings. They're tribute pieces for fallen soldiers." The woman in black shook her head stubbornly. "Anyone can claim that. Real military families don't deface themselves like this. We honor our dead with dignity, not with street art." The officer's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I'm going to stop you right there. This woman's tattoo shows more knowledge of military tradition and sacrifice than most civilians ever acquire. These coordinates," he pointed to numbers woven into the design, "correspond to Fire Base Charlie in Afghanistan. These unit insignia belong to the 101st Airborne Division." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. Finally, someone understood what they were looking at. Someone recognized the careful thought and research that had gone into memorializing her brother and his unit properly. "Furthermore," the officer continued, his voice gaining authority, "the placement and style of these memorial elements follows a tradition that dates back decades among military families. It's not uncommon for siblings, parents, or spouses of fallen soldiers to commemorate their loss this way." The crowd began to shift uncomfortably, realizing their mistake but unwilling to admit it publicly. The security guards had stopped their approach, uncertain how to proceed now that a high-ranking military officer had taken control of the situation. "I don't care what you say," the elderly man who had spoken earlier declared. "My son died for this country, and I know what military families look like. This woman is not one of us." The officer turned his full attention to the man, his stance becoming even more formal and commanding. "Sir, with all due respect to your loss, you're wrong. This woman's tattoo indicates she lost someone very close to her in combat. The level of detail and accuracy in these memorial elements suggests she has intimate knowledge of military service and sacrifice." Sarah found her voice, strengthened by the officer's support. "My brother Marcus was killed in Afghanistan 2 years ago. He was serving with the 101st Airborne when his convoy was attacked. 3 other members of his unit died with him. This tattoo memorializes all 4 of them." She held up the framed photo of Marcus, and several people in the crowd leaned forward to get a better look. The resemblance between siblings was clear, and Marcus's uniform and insignia matched the elements incorporated into Sarah's tattoo. "The coordinates on my arm mark the exact location where they died," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "The roses represent each fallen soldier, and the thorns represent the pain their families carry. Every element of this design was researched and verified through military records and conversations with their fellow soldiers." The officer nodded approvingly. "This is exactly the kind of memorial tattoo I've seen among military families who want to carry their loved ones with them permanently. It's a deeply personal way of honoring sacrifice and maintaining connection to fallen heroes." The woman in black looked around at the crowd, seeing the doubt beginning to creep into their faces. But she wasn't ready to concede. "Even if that's true, it's still inappropriate for a formal ceremony. There should be standards for how we honor our military dead." "Ma'am," the officer replied firmly, "this woman has every right to be here, and her method of honoring fallen soldiers is both personal and valid. In fact, her tattoo demonstrates a level of commitment to memory and honor that many would find admirable rather than offensive." He turned back to Sarah, his expression softening. "What was your brother's full name and rank?" "Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez Martinez," Sarah replied. "He enlisted right out of high school and served 2 tours before he was killed." The officer's face showed recognition. "I knew Marcus. Not personally, but I was briefed on the attack that claimed his life and his unit members. It was a significant loss for the 101st, and their sacrifice was noted at the highest levels of command." The crowd fell completely silent now, the weight of this revelation settling over them like a heavy blanket. They had been confronting the sister of a decorated soldier, treating her like a criminal while she tried to attend a ceremony honoring her brother's sacrifice. "In fact," the officer continued, "I believe Staff Sergeant Martinez was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star for his actions during the attack. He died trying to protect civilian contractors who were trapped in the convoy." Sarah nodded, tears flowing freely now. "He always said his job was to bring everyone home safely. Even when he couldn't save himself, he made sure others survived." The officer's next words rang out clearly across the suddenly quiet Memorial Park. This woman deserves not only our respect but our gratitude. Her brother died serving this country, and she has chosen to honor his memory in a way that ensures she carries his sacrifice with her always." The silence that followed the officer's words was profound and uncomfortable. The crowd that had been so certain of their righteousness just minutes before now stood frozen, grappling with the reality of their mistake. Sarah could see the recognition dawning on their faces as they realized they had been harassing a Gold Star sister, a woman whose family had paid the ultimate price for their freedom. The officer wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be an official database. "Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez Martinez, service number 123456789, he read aloud. "Killed in action on March 15, 2023, along with Corporal James Thompson, Private First Class David Kim, and Specialist Robert Johnson. All four were posthumously decorated for valor." Each name hit the crowd like a physical blow. These weren't abstract concepts or distant news stories. These were real people with families, with sisters like Sarah who mourned them every day. The tattoo they had found so offensive was actually a living memorial to American heroes. The woman in black who had started the confrontation looked stricken. Her face had gone pale, and she seemed to be struggling with how to respond to this revelation. The elderly man who had claimed his own son's sacrifice stepped forward hesitantly. I apologize," he said quietly, his earlier hostility replaced by shame. "I lost my boy in Iraq, and I thought I was protecting his memory. I was wrong." Sarah looked at him with understanding rather than anger. "Your son died serving his country just like my brother. We're both part of the same family, the family of those left behind. I would never dishonor your son's memory, just as I hope you wouldn't dishonor Marcus's." The officer nodded approvingly at Sarah's response. This is exactly what military families should be, united in their shared sacrifice and understanding, not divided by misunderstanding and prejudice. He turned to address the broader crowd, his voice carrying the authority of command. "Let me be absolutely clear about something. This woman's tattoo is not only appropriate but exemplary. It demonstrates a level of respect and remembrance that honors not just her brother, but all fallen soldiers." Other people in the crowd began to step forward, some offering quiet apologies, others simply acknowledging Sarah with respectful nods. The security guards who had been approaching to remove her now stood at a respectful distance, clearly understanding that the situation had changed completely. "The elements of this memorial tattoo," the officer continued, pointing to various aspects of Sarah's arm, "show extensive research and genuine understanding of military culture. The unit insignia are accurate, the coordinates are precise, and the symbolism reflects deep knowledge of how soldiers honor their fallen comrades." A younger woman in the crowd raised her hand tentatively. "I'm so sorry," she said to Sarah. "I lost my husband in Syria, and I should have recognized the pain in your eyes. I should have known you were one of us." Sarah smiled through her tears. "We all grieve differently. There's no wrong way to honor the people we've lost, as long as it comes from love." The officer reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It was a military challenge coin, one that she recognized from Marcus's collection. "This is from the 101st Airborne Division," he explained. "I want you to have it not just as recognition of your brother's service, but as acknowledgement of your own sacrifice." "My sacrifice?" Sarah asked, confused. "You've carried his memory and his honor for 2 years, enduring judgment and harassment because people didn't understand what your tattoo represented. You've suffered in silence to keep his legacy alive. That's a different kind of service, but service nonetheless." The ceremony was beginning now, with families taking their seats and speakers preparing to honor the fallen. But something had changed in the atmosphere. Where there had been division and hostility, there was now unity and understanding. The woman in black approached Sarah hesitantly. Would you sit with us? My daughter was killed in a training accident, and I realize now that we're fighting the same battle against being forgotten." Sarah nodded, accepting the invitation. As they walked toward the seating area together, she could hear conversations starting around them. People were sharing their own stories of loss, their own ways of remembering, their own struggles with grief and honor. The officer walked alongside Sarah, his presence serving as both protection and validation. "You know," he said quietly, "your brother would be proud of how you've honored him. But more than that, He would be proud of how you've handled the treatment you've received. You've shown grace under fire, which is one of the highest military virtues. During the ceremony, several speakers mentioned the importance of supporting military families and understanding that grief takes many forms. Sarah noticed that when her brother's name was read among the honored dead, people around her stood a little straighter, their applause a little stronger. After the formal program ended, the officer approached Sarah once more. "I want you to know that this incident will be reported to the appropriate authorities. The harassment you've endured is unacceptable, and steps will be taken to ensure other military families don't face similar treatment." But Sarah shook her head. "That's not necessary. Today changed things. People saw the truth and they understood. Sometimes that's all we can ask for. The chance to be seen for who we really are instead of what people assume we are." As the crowd began to disperse, many people stopped to speak with Sarah. They shared their own stories, offered their phone numbers, and invited her to join support groups for military families. The tattoo that had isolated her for so long had finally become what it was always meant to be, a bridge, connecting her to others who understood loss and sacrifice. The elderly man who had challenged her earlier approached one final time. "My son's name was Kevin," he said simply. "He was 22 when he died. I've been angry for so long that I forgot how to recognize fellow travelers on this difficult road." Sarah shook his hand warmly. Marcus was 24. They were both too young, and they both died serving something bigger than themselves. That makes us family, whether we like it or not. As Sarah walked back to her car, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years: belonging. The officer's intervention had done more than just stop harassment. It had opened a door to a community she had been excluded from by misunderstanding and prejudice. For the first time since getting her memorial tattoo, she felt truly proud to display it, knowing that at least some people now understood what it really meant. The challenge coin in her pocket felt warm against her fingers, a tangible reminder that Marcus's sacrifice had been recognized and honored, and that her own journey of remembrance had finally found its proper place among those who understood the weight of military loss.